Picture this scenario. You're scrolling through your banking app at 2 in the morning, and instead of that familiar knot forming in your stomach, you actually smile. For the first time in your adult life, you see six figures staring back at you. $100,000. It's a number that felt impossible just a few years ago, but now it's real. And here's what nobody tells you about hitting this milestone. Everything changes, but not in the way you think it will. My name is Emmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why some people seem to effortlessly navigate major wealth milestones while others get completely overwhelmed by success. If you've ever wondered what it actually feels like to cross that six-figure threshold, or more importantly, how it fundamentally shifts your entire relationship with money and opportunity, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps you understand what's really happening behind the scenes. Now, before we dive into the psychological transformation that occurs at $100,000, let me paint you a picture of what most people think this moment will feel like. You probably imagine throwing your hands up in celebration, maybe calling everyone you know, or finally buying that thing you've been wanting for years. The reality is much more subtle and honestly much more profound than any of that surface-level excitement. When you hit $100,000 in savings or investments, something fascinating happens to your brain that most people never see coming. You don't suddenly feel rich or start making wildly different spending decisions. Instead, you experience what I call the confidence cascade. Every financial choice you make from this point forward gets filtered through a completely different lens, and it starts affecting areas of your life that have nothing to do with money. Think about the last time you had to make a big financial decision. Maybe it was choosing between job offers, deciding whether to move to a new city, or figuring out if you could afford to take time off for something important. When you're operating without a substantial financial cushion, these decisions feel terrifying because the stakes seem impossibly high. One wrong move could derail everything you've worked for. But here's where the $100,000 threshold creates its first major shift. Suddenly, these same decisions feel manageable. Not because you're planning to spend that money, but because you know it exists. This psychological safety net transforms you from someone who makes survival-based choices to someone who makes strategic ones. You stop asking whether you can afford something and start asking whether it's the best use of your resources. The fascinating part is how this mindset change ripples out into every aspect of your decision-making process. When you're not constantly worried about financial survival, your brain has bandwidth to think about growth and optimization. Instead of just getting through the next month, you start noticing opportunities that were always there, but felt too risky to pursue when you were living closer to the edge. Let's talk about what happens to your relationship with work. Once you cross this threshold, most people assume that having money makes you lazy or less motivated, but the opposite is usually true. When you have $100,000 saved, you're not working from a place of desperation anymore. You're working from a place of choice. And that psychological shift changes everything about how you show up professionally. Or you negotiate differently because you're not afraid of walking away from a bad deal. You take on projects that align with your long-term goals instead of just grabbing whatever pays the bills. You invest in your skills and education because you can afford to think beyond immediate returns. This confidence often leads to better opportunities, higher compensation, and more interesting work, creating a positive feedback loop that accelerates your financial progress even further. But here's something that might surprise you about reaching $100,000. The number itself becomes almost irrelevant compared to what you learned getting there. Think about what it actually takes to accumulate that amount of money from nothing. Unless you inherited it or got incredibly lucky, you had to develop serious discipline around spending, saving, and investing. You had to resist countless temptations and make difficult choices consistently over months or years. More importantly, you prove to yourself that you can control money instead of letting it control you. This identity shift is enormous because it affects every financial decision you make going forward. You're no longer someone who hopes to have money someday. You're someone who builds wealth systematically and deliberately. The compound effect of this psychological transformation extends far beyond your bank account balance. When you know you can accumulate $100,000, you start thinking differently about your next 100,000. The process that felt impossible initially now feels like a system you can replicate and scale. Your relationship with risk evolves in ways that open up entirely new categories of opportunities. That side business idea you've been thinking about doesn't feel so scary when you have substantial savings backing you up. The possibility of changing careers becomes something you can explore instead of just fantasize about. Investment opportunities that seemed too risky or complex before now feel worth investigating. This is where most people completely underestimate the true power of hitting six figures. It's not about having enough money to buy expensive things. It's about having enough money to make choices based on what you actually want instead of what you think you can afford. Here's something that happens around the $100,000 mark that nobody talks about in personal finance circles. You start viewing money as a tool for buying time instead of just buying things. Before this milestone, most of your financial decisions revolve around whether you can afford something right now. After crossing this threshold, you start asking different questions entirely. Instead of wondering if you can afford a house cleaner, you ask whether your time is worth more than the cost of the service. Instead of debating whether to pay for convenience, you calculate the value of the hours you'll save. This shift fundamentally changes how you structure your life. You become willing to pay premiums for things that give you more time or reduce friction in your daily routine. Not because you're being careless with money, but because you understand that time is the only resource you can never get back. The person with $100,000 saved isn't necessarily spending more money, but they're spending it more strategically. Let me tell you about something called decision fatigue that most people experience without even realizing it. Every day, you make hundreds of micro-financial decisions. Can I afford this coffee? Should I take an Uber or walk? Is it worth paying extra for organic groceries? Each of these tiny choices burns mental energy, and by the end of the day, you're exhausted from constantly calculating whether you can afford things. But when you have substantial savings, roughly 90% of these daily financial decisions become completely irrelevant. You're not choosing between name brand and generic products because you're worried about your bank account. You're choosing based on what you actually prefer or what saves you time. This mental bandwidth that gets freed up is incredible. Imagine how much cognitive energy you'd have available if you stopped making survival calculations 50 times per day. The psychological relief goes deeper than just reduced stress. When you're not constantly worried about money, you sleep better. Studies show that financial security dramatically improves sleep quality, which affects everything from your immune system to your decision-making abilities. You become more patient with family and friends because you're not carrying that underlying tension about bills and expenses. Your relationships improve because financial stress isn't poisoning your interactions with the people you care about. Here's where things get really interesting from a career perspective. Having $100,000 doesn't just change how you negotiate your current job. It changes what kinds of opportunities you're willing to consider in the first place. Maybe there's a position at a startup that offers equity instead of a high salary. Without savings, that's too risky to even think about. With your financial foundation, you can evaluate whether the potential upside is worth the risk. Or perhaps you've always wanted to work in a different industry, but the transition would require taking a temporary pay cut while you learn new skills. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, career pivots feel impossible. When you have substantial savings, they become strategic moves you can actually execute. The networking aspect changes dramatically too. You start attending conferences, joining professional organizations, and investing in relationships because you can afford to think beyond immediate returns. These investments in your professional network often pay dividends for decades, but they require upfront costs that broke people simply can't justify. But here's something that might challenge everything you think you know about wealthy people. Most individuals who successfully accumulate their first $100,000 don't dramatically increase their spending. In fact, many of them become even more intentional about their purchases because they understand the opportunity cost of every dollar spent. They've seen firsthand how money grows when you invest it instead of spending it. That fancy restaurant meal isn't just $60 anymore. It's $60 that could have grown to over $400 in their investment account over 20 years. This doesn't mean they never enjoy themselves, but they become much more selective about what's worth the trade-off. This is where a lot of people get confused about the psychology of wealth building. They assume that having money makes you want to spend it, but the opposite is often true. The process of accumulating substantial savings teaches you to find satisfaction in growing your net worth rather than in accumulating possessions. It's like a completely different game with different rules and different rewards. The identity shift that happens at $100,000 extends into how you think about your future self. Before this milestone, retirement feels like some abstract concept that may or may not happen. After crossing this threshold, you start doing actual math about when you could potentially achieve financial independence. Not because $100,000 is enough to retire on, but because you now have proof that systematic saving and investing actually works. You begin thinking in decades instead of months, which completely transforms how you evaluate opportunities and make decisions about everything from education to relationships to where you choose to live. So, there you have it. Hitting $100,000 isn't about suddenly becoming wealthy or changing your entire lifestyle overnight. It's about crossing an invisible threshold that fundamentally rewires how your brain processes risk, opportunity, and choice. You shift from survival mode to strategic mode. You stop making decisions based on fear and start making them based on what actually serves your long-term goals. The beautiful irony is that the person who accumulates their first $100,000 often looks exactly the same from the outside. They're not driving fancy cars or living in mansions. But internally, everything has changed. They've developed the most valuable financial skill anyone can possess, which isn't earning money or even investing money. It's the ability to think clearly about money without letting emotions and fear drive their decisions. Whether you're currently at $0 or $90,000, the principles remain the same. Focus on building that foundation systematically and deliberately. Don't get distracted by the shortcuts or the get-rich-quick schemes. The real transformation happens gradually and then all at once when you cross that psychological threshold. Remember, the goal isn't just to reach $100,000. The goal is to become the type of person who can reach $100,000. Because once you develop that identity and those skills, every subsequent milestone becomes not just possible, but inevitable.